Looking back now, I realize I had everything most women only dream of. Adrian was pulling in serious money at his Silicon Valley tech job. We lived in this gorgeous house with marble countertops and a view that made our friends actually gasp when they walked onto the deck. And honestly, I looked amazing. I mean, I put effort into myself, kept in shape, knew how to dress, knew how to be the kind of wife that made other men wonder what they were doing wrong in their own marriages. For the first few years, everything was perfect. Adrian would come home from his high stress job, and I'd have dinner ready, the house looking like something out of a magazine. And we'd talk about our days over wine that costs more than most people spend on groceries in a week. I loved our life. I loved going to work events where all the other wives would ask where I got my dress or compliment my hair. And I especially loved the way Adrian would look at me across the room like he couldn't believe his luck. But then he started getting restless. At first, it was just little comments here and there about wanting to do something more meaningful, wanting to build something of his own instead of making other people rich. I'd smile and nod because honestly, I thought it was just typical midlife crisis stuff that would pass. Men go through phases, right? They think they want to climb mountains or buy motorcycles or whatever, but eventually reality kicks in and they remember they have responsibilities. Except Adrienne's phase didn't pass. If anything, it got worse. He started talking about startups and innovation and all this entrepreneur like he was some 22-year-old kid fresh out of college, instead of a grown man with a mortgage and a wife who had gotten used to a certain standard of living. The worst part was how serious he was about it. He'd show me these business plans he'd been working on, talk about market opportunities and funding strategies, and I'd just sit there thinking, are you completely insane? I tried to be supportive at first. I really did. When he'd go on and on about his brilliant ideas, I'd listen and ask questions and try to seem interested. But inside, I was screaming because couldn't he see what we had? Couldn't he appreciate that we were living better than 90% of the population? We had security, we had comfort, we had status, and he wanted to throw it all away to chase some fantasy about being the next Steve Jobs. The conversation I'd been dreading finally happened on a Tuesday. Night over dinner, Adrian had been quieter than usual all week, and I could tell he was building up to something. When he finally spoke, he laid out this whole plan about how he'd been saving money for 5 years, how he had enough to support us for at least 18 months while he got his business off the ground, how this was his chance to really make something of himself. I just stared at him. 5 years he'd been planning this behind my back. 5 years of secretly squirreling away money and making plans that would completely upend our life without even consulting me about what I wanted. The audacity was breathtaking. Adrian, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, I need you to really think about what you're saying here. You want to give up a guaranteed six-figure income to start some risky business that might not even work. You want us to go from eating at the best restaurants in the city to worrying about grocery bills. You want me to give up everything I love about our life so you can play entrepreneur. He got that stubborn look on his face that I was starting to hate. It's not playing Stella. This is something I'm passionate about, something that could actually make a difference and financially would be fine. I've run all the numbers. The numbers don't account for what happens if you fail. I shot back. What happens when 18 months turns into 2 years or 3 years or never? What happens when we lose the house? What happens when I have to explain to my friends why we can't afford to go on vacation anymore? We went round and round like that for hours. Him talking about dreams and passion and making a difference, me trying to inject some actual reality into the conversation. By the end of the night, I thought I'd gotten through to him. He seemed to understand my concerns, seemed to realize that maybe this wasn't the right time for such a drastic change. I was wrong. For the next 2 years, the same conversation kept happening. Adrian would bring up the startup idea. I'd explain why it was a terrible decision and he'd back down. But I could see the resentment building in his eyes, like somehow I was the villain for wanting to protect what we'd built together. Then one day he came home and just announced that he'd quit. Not asked, not discussed, just quit. Like my opinion didn't matter at all. Like the 6 years we'd been married and the life we'd created together was just something he could unilaterally decide to change. I was furious, but I tried to hide it. What choice did I have? The damage was already done and throwing a tantrum wasn't going to get his job back. So I smiled and said I supported him and that we'd figure it out together, even though inside I was screaming at his selfishness. At first, I really did try to be the supportive wife. When he'd get excited about some potential client or partnership, I'd listen and nod and tell him how proud I was. But as the weeks turned into months and our lifestyle started changing in ways I couldn't ignore anymore, it got harder and harder to pretend I was okay with what he'd done to us. We stopped going to our favorite restaurants because they were too expensive. We started buying generic brands at the grocery store. Adrian would flinch every time I bought something that wasn't absolutely necessary. Like somehow my skincare routine or the occasional shopping trip was going to bankrupt us. The worst part was watching him stress about money constantly when we'd never had to think about it before. I started pulling away, both emotionally and physically. Why should I pretend to be happy about a situation I'd explicitly told him would be a disaster? Why should I reward his selfishness with affection and support when he'd completely ignored my feelings and concerns? If Adrian wanted to choose his business over our marriage, then he could live with the consequences of that choice. The fighting got worse as his stress levels increased. Every conversation seemed to turn into an argument about money or sacrifice or whether I was being supportive enough. Adrian would accuse me of being materialistic, like wanting to maintain the lifestyle we'd worked for together was somehow shallow. I'd point out that he'd made this decision unilaterally and that I was dealing with the fallout of his midlife crisis. And he'd get defensive and start talking about dreams and passion like that was supposed to make up for everything he put us through. By the time we hit the 6-month mark, I was completely checked out emotionally. I felt like I was married to a stranger, someone who cared more about some abstract business success than about his actual wife's happiness. We barely talked unless we were fighting, and we definitely weren't having sex. Why would I want to be intimate with someone who basically told me my feelings and preferences didn't matter? That's when I started noticing Cameron at the social events we still occasionally attended. He was everything Adrian used to be and more. Successful, established, confident in a way that comes from actually having money rather than just dreaming about making it someday. When Cameron talked about his business, it was from the perspective of someone who'd already succeeded, not someone desperately hoping to prove himself. Cameron noticed me, too. He'd seek me out at parties, compliment me on my dress or my hair, ask thoughtful questions about my life that made it clear he was actually listening to my answers. It was such a relief to talk to a man who understood what it meant to have standards, who didn't think wanting nice things was some kind of character flaw. I wasn't looking to have an affair, not at first, but Adrian had become this stressed, distracted version of himself who seemed to barely notice I existed unless he needed emotional support for his struggling business. Meanwhile, Cameron was charming and attentive and successful in all the ways Adrian used to be. When he asked for my number, I gave it to him. When he invited me to lunch, I went. The emotional affair turned physical pretty quickly. Cameron knew how to make a woman feel desired, appreciated, valued. He took me to beautiful restaurants, bought me thoughtful gifts, made me feel like I was worth pursuing instead of just some obligation he had to manage around his real priorities. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again instead of some budget-conscious shadow of who I used to be. I knew it was wrong, but honestly, Adrian had checked out of our marriage long before I did. He'd chosen his business over me, chosen his dreams over our life together, chosen his own fulfillment over my happiness. If he could make unilateral decisions about our future, then so could I. By Christmas, Adrian and I weren't even pretending to have a marriage anymore. We barely spoke unless absolutely necessary, and even then, it was usually about logistics or money. I left a note saying I was going to my aunt's house rather than trying to have an actual conversation with him because what was the point? We both knew things were over between us. New Year's Eve felt like the perfect time to stop hiding what everyone probably already suspected anyway. I went to the party with Cameron, and for the first time in months, I felt beautiful and desired and valued. When midnight approached and Cameron put his arm around me, I didn't pull away. When Adrian showed up and saw us together, part of me was actually relieved that everything was finally out in the open. The confrontation at home Later that night was brutal, but also liberating. Adrian stood there looking shocked and betrayed, like he had any right to be surprised that his wife had found someone who actually appreciated her. So, what if I am? I told him when he asked if I was cheating. I have the right to decide for myself, just the way you do. He just stared at me like I'd slapped him, but I wasn't done. 6 months of resentment and anger came pouring out. I'm gonna jump you right away. I said, that guy is far more successful, established than you ever would be. I deserve no less. It felt incredible to finally tell him exactly what I thought, to stop pretending like his choices hadn't completely destroyed what we had together. He'd made his decision when he quit his job and threw away our security for some entrepreneurial fantasy. Now I was making mine. The divorce happened quickly. Adrian didn't even fight me on the asset division, probably because he was eager to get rid of me so he could focus entirely on his precious business. Without any distractions, fine by me. I was ready to start my new life with someone who actually had his priorities straight. Cameron and I got married 6 months after my divorce was finalized. And initially, everything felt perfect. He had this gorgeous house, drove expensive cars, knew all the right people. I felt like I was finally with someone who matched my standards, someone who understood what it meant to live well. But pretty quickly, crack started showing. Cameron didn't actually work. It turned out all his money came from his father's business empire, and he seemed to think that entitled him to treat me more like an accessory than a partner. When I'd suggest activities or express opinions about our social calendar, he'd dismiss me or make decisions without consulting me. It was like being married to a spoiled child who happened to have access to daddy's credit cards. Things got worse when Cameron's father decided to hand control of the family business over to Cameron's older brother instead. Apparently, Cameron's reputation for being irresponsible and entitled had finally caught up with him, and his father had lost confidence in his ability to handle serious responsibility. That's when I saw Cameron's real personality. Without the security of knowing he'd inherit everything, he became paranoid, controlling, and eventually abusive. He'd scream at me over tiny things, blame me for his family problems, and make it clear that he saw me as just another expense he could no longer afford. I'd quit my job after we got married because Cameron had insisted he could support us both. And by the time I realized what a mistake that had been, my skills were already getting outdated. The job market had moved on while I'd been playing housewife to an increasingly unstable man. When Cameron finally lost his inheritance completely, everything fell apart fast. We lost the house, the cars, everything that had made me think he was such a catch in the first place. His family wanted nothing to do with me, treating me like I was some gold digger who'd corrupted their precious son rather than acknowledging that Cameron had been a disaster long before I came along. I ended up homeless, literally homeless, bouncing between cheap motel and eventually moving in with this guy, Christian, who I barely knew, but who at least had a couch I could sleep on. My car got repossessed, my credit got destroyed, and I was eating dollar menu fast food and instant ramen like some college student instead of the successful woman I had always been. Meanwhile, I started hearing through mutual acquaintances that Adrian's business was actually taking off. Apparently, his stupid startup idea hadn't been so stupid after all, and he was making serious money again. Even worse, he'd found some new girlfriend, this tech worker named Audrey, who everyone said was brilliant and kind and perfect for him. The injustice of it was overwhelming. I'd supported Adrian for 6 years, been the perfect wife while he was climbing the corporate ladder, and when I finally chose to prioritize my own happiness, everything fell apart. But he got to throw away our marriage, chase his selfish dreams, and somehow come out ahead. It wasn't fair. I started trying to reach out to him just to see if maybe we could talk. Maybe he'd be willing to help me get back on my feet after everything we'd shared together after 6 years of marriage. Surely he'd at least be willing to acknowledge that I was struggling and could use some assistance from someone who knew me and cared about me. But Adrian's office staff wouldn't even let me pass the lobby. His little secretary, Melody, would give me these fake, sympathetic looks while telling me that Adrian wasn't available and that I should try calling instead. Calling never worked either. He'd blocked my number, blocked my email, apparently blocked every possible way I had of reaching him. The few times I did manage to get past security and confront him directly, Adrian treated me like I was some stranger off the street instead of his ex-wife. When I pointed out that his staff should know who I was, that I deserve basic respect as someone who'd been married to him for 6 years, he just looked at me with this cold expression I'd never seen before. "You're not my wife," he said, "and no one needs to know you here." I tried explaining my situation, how I'd left my job because of the relationship with Cameron, how my skills had gotten outdated, how I just needed a chance to get back on my feet. I reminded him of what I was capable of, how I had supported him during his own career struggles. But Adrian was completely unmoved. "You sabotaged me when I wanted to build something of my own," he said. "Now you want me to give you a shot? Sorry, I don't run a charity." The cruelty was breathtaking. This was the man I'd been married to for 6 years, the man I'd supported through his own career challenges. And now that he was successful again, he couldn't even show me basic human decency. Apparently, his new girlfriend, Audrey, had completely replaced any memory of what we'd once meant to each other. Sitting here now in Christian's depressing apartment, eating another cup of noodles while scrolling through social media photos of Adrian and Audrey at some charity gala, I can't help but think about how unfair life is. I made one mistake, choosing Cameron over Adrian. And somehow that means I deserve to lose everything. Meanwhile, Adrian gets to be the success story, the entrepreneur who followed his dreams and found love with someone new. I gave him the best years of my life. I was there when he was nobody, when he was just another tech worker grinding away at someone else's company. I supported him, believed in him, made a beautiful home for him. And the one time I chose my own happiness over his unrealistic dreams, suddenly I'm the villain. The truth is, Adrian got lucky. His startup could just as easily have failed, like 90% of them do. And then where would he be? Probably crawling back to me, begging for forgiveness, admitting that I'd been right all along about the risks he was taking with our future. But instead, he gets to be vindicated, and I get to be the cautionary tale, the woman who chose security over love, who couldn't support her husband's dreams, who threw away a good marriage for a man with more money. Never mind that Adrian had already thrown away our marriage when he decided his business was more important than my feelings. Never mind that Cameron had seemed like a safe choice, a mature choice, a choice that would give me the stability Adrian was so eager to gamble away. I keep thinking that eventually Adrian will remember what we had together. He'll realize that Audrey, for all her supposed brilliance, is just some rebound relationship, and that I'm the one who really knew him, really supported him, really deserved to share in his success. We built something together for 6 years. That has to count for something, right? But every day that passes, it becomes clearer that Adrian has moved on completely. He's not just successful now, he's happy. And apparently, that happiness doesn't include any room for forgiveness or compassion for the woman who used to be the most important person in his life. Maybe that's the real injustice here. Not just that my life fell apart while his got better, but that he seems to feel no guilt about it whatsoever. Like our 6 years together meant so little that he can just erase me from his life without a second thought. Like, I'm not even worth basic human kindness, let alone the respect due to someone who used to share his bed and his dreams and his future. I know people would say I brought this on myself, that I made my choices and now I have to live with the consequences, but they don't understand what it was like watching the man you married transform into someone you barely recognized, someone who cared more about some abstract business success than about the real concrete life you'd built together. And you were forced me to choose between supporting his dreams and protecting my own future. When I chose wrong, I lost everything. When he chose his dreams over our marriage, he got everything he wanted and more. If that's not injustice, I don't know what.